Maggie's fingers trembled as she pried the rusted safe door open in the damp, lightless basement of the diner. Above her, the floorboards groaned under the weight of the town's elders, men who still whispered her father's name like a prayer to a patron saint. She expected to find the deed that would save their legacy, but as the beam of her flashlight hit the interior, she didn't find gold or titles. Instead, a mountain of debt markers from Atlantic City casinos and leather-bound ledgers spilled out, their pages covered in her father's jagged, frantic handwriting. The air in the cellar turned cold as Maggie realized the dates in the books matched the exact weeks the town's relief fund had mysteriously vanished 30 years ago. Outside, she could hear the muffled sound of the mayor's voice through the vents, announcing the annual parade to honor the hero of Black Ridge. Maggie looked at the portrait of her father leaning against the stone wall. His painted eyes seemed to watch her, a silent warning that some secrets are buried deep for a reason, and unearthing them might just burn the rest of the town to the ground. The heavy iron key groaned as it turned within the lock, a sound that echoed like a terminal rattle through the quiet street of Black Ridge. Maggie Callahan leaned her shoulder against the massive oak door, forcing it open against the resistance of swollen wood and years of accumulated grit. Inside, the air held the stagnant weight of old fryer grease and the metallic tang of copper pipes. Dawn's first light filtered through the grime-streaked windows, illuminating a spiderweb of cracks in the plaster that stretched across the walls like a map of forgotten, dead-end roads. Maggie ran her palm over the cold surface of the counter, her skin catching on a deep, jagged notch in the laminate where some frustrated miner had likely dug his nails in decades ago. Rows of empty stools stood atop the tables, legs pointing toward the ceiling like a graveyard of overturned beetles. She forced herself to look away from the faded rectangular patches on the wallpaper, ghosts of photographs that once boasted of happy patrons, and flipped the switch on the industrial coffee machine. Its sudden, straining roar filled the oppressive silence of the empty hall, a mechanical scream that matched the tension knotting her stomach. The bell above the door gave a sharp, discordant jingle, slicing through the morning gloom. A man in a slate-gray suit stepped onto the worn linoleum, his polished shoes emitting a clinical squeak that seemed to mock the surrounding decay. He didn't bother removing his hat. His gaze flicked upward, lingering with visible distaste on a brownish water stain spreading across the ceiling tiles. Without a word, he slid a thick envelope onto the counter, the heavy cream paper bearing a government seal that looked like a bruise against the formica. The inspector traced a manicured finger along the edge of the notice, pointing to the bold, uncompromising font. Emergency condition. Demolition scheduled in 7 days. Maggie felt a creeping frost move from her fingertips, crawling up her arms until it settled like lead in her chest. The man gave a curt, professional nod, turned on his heel, and vanished back into the gray morning. He left behind the sterile scent of bureaucratic paper and a death warrant for her life's work, held in place against the sticky tabletop by a chipped glass sugar shaker. Old Miller descended onto a stool with a groan, his joints emitting a dry, rhythmic crunch. Maggie slid a mug of thick coffee toward him, the rising steam tickling his face, which was a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles and coal-scarred skin. The old miner reached out, covering Maggie's hand with a palm as rough as sandpaper, smelling of tobacco and the persistent dust of the pits. He gestured with a trembling chin toward the portrait hanging behind the counter, whispering that Frank Callahan was the only soul who hadn't turned his back on them during the Black Year. Miller drifted into a familiar refrain, recounting how Frank had shared his last loaf of bread with the picketers, calling the late owner the patron saint of this dying town. Maggie managed to stretch her lips into a hollow smile, though her insides twisted. Every word of praise from the old man felt like another stone added to a pack she was already too weak to carry, the crushing weight of a city's desperate, misplaced hope. Maggie sat on the very edge of a rigid chair in the loan officer's office, her knuckles white as she gripped her battered purse. Outside the bank's glass walls, the town of Black Ridge hummed with the listless energy of the unemployed. But inside, the only sound was the rhythmic, predatory clicking of a calculator. The officer scowled at his monitor, where the red columns of Frank's Diner debt marched across the screen like an invading army. Maggie tried to speak of renovation plans, of the historical value of the landmark, but her voice failed her, thinning to a desperate whisper that died in the air-conditioned chill. The officer snapped the folder shut with a final, hollow thud and shook his head with practiced sympathy. The formal rejection slid across the desk, a heavy weight of ink and judgment. Catching her own reflection in the man's spectacles, Maggie saw a pale, defeated ghost and realized that to the bank, Frank Callahan's legacy was nothing more than a non-performing asset trending toward zero. The diner door swung shut, cutting off the rhythmic thrum of the street. Maggie stood frozen before the massive frame where Frank Callahan remained preserved in oil and ego. From the canvas, a man with a granite jaw and a practiced, kindly crinkle around the eyes stared back, his hand resting with staged confidence on a worker's shoulder. Maggie reached out, her fingers trailing over the gilded molding and coming away coated in a fine, gray silt. Frank's gaze seemed uncomfortably alive, a silent demand for her to keep standing guard over this rotting temple. She felt invisible wires of duty wrap around her shoulders, pulling her toward the floor. Every new crack in the plaster now felt like a fresh laceration on her father's body. Maggie pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the portrait, searching the painted depths of Frank's eyes for an answer, a sign, or even a hint of where to find the strength to hold up the sky for one more day. Toby tugged at the hem of Maggie's apron, his eyes wide with a child's unburdened curiosity. He pointed a small finger at a yellowed newspaper clipping pressed under the glass of the display case, showing Frank Callahan standing atop an armored truck, shouting to a sea of desperate men. The boy begged for the 100th time to hear the story of how Grandpa had vanquished the greedy mine bosses. Maggie swallowed the bitter lump in her throat, reaching down to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her son's ear. She began to recite the familiar liturgy, words of honor, of iron-willed courage, and how Frank had shielded every working man at the cost of his own peace. Each syllable of the Callahan legend rang in her ears like a rehearsed prayer, hollow and echoing, while outside the window, city workers were already unloading the orange barricades meant to cordon off her father's house for the wrecking ball. Maggie pushed open the groaning door to the basement, and a wall of dampness and the smell of decomposing paper hit her full in the face. The beam of her flashlight cut through the subterranean gloom, snagging on piles of broken furniture and stacks of newspapers that had turned the color of tobacco spit. She picked her way through the wreckage, the sleeve of her work shirt catching on rusted nails protruding from the joists. She heaved over heavy crates marked with the fading seal of the miners' union, her heart hammering with the hope of finding a misplaced deed or a forgotten title of ownership. Dust swirled into her lungs, forcing a jagged, racking cough from her throat. She threw aside the junk with a frantic energy, imagining a scenario where she could leverage this building to the bank and salvage Frank's memory. Her fingers trembled with exhaustion as she finally reached the furthest corner, a space hidden behind a stack of rotting floorboards. Maggie braced her feet against the uneven concrete and, with a guttural groan, shoved aside a massive steel shelving unit overflowing with empty, dust-caked bottles. The metal shrieked against the stone floor, sending a spray of sparks into the dark. As the rack finally ground to a halt, the beam of her flashlight froze on a clean, sharp-edged rectangle set deep into the brickwork. It was a heavy steel safe door, its dial encrusted with decades of soot and neglect. Maggie ran her hand over the cold, unforgiving metal, feeling the raised numbers beneath her grime-streaked fingers. her heart beat in a frantic, uneven rhythm that matched the steady drip-drip of a leaky pipe in the shadows. Here, hidden behind the public face of Frank Callahan, lay a secret that had remained undisturbed for decades, something unknown to every living soul in this suffocating little valley. Maggie scrambled toward a box of Frank's personal effects, dumping out broken watches and tarnished cufflinks onto the floor in a frantic heap. At the very bottom, wrapped in a rag stinking of machine oil, her fingers closed around a heavy, blued steel key. She hurried back to the safe, her breathing coming in loud, ragged hitches that echoed off the damp walls. The key slid into the keyhole with a stubborn resistance, fighting against years of accumulated rust. Maggie threw her entire weight into the turn, straining until a sickeningly sweet, metallic clack resonated through the chamber. The door swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing the dark maw of the hidden vault. She stood perfectly still, afraid to draw a full breath, as the safe exhaled the scent of old leather and a stagnant, heavy sense of shame that Frank Callahan had spent a lifetime burying. Instead of land deeds or property titles, Maggie pulled several thick, leather-bound ledgers from the darkness. As she cracked open the first volume, a cascade of colorful slips and debt markers embossed with the Atlantic City Casino logo spilled onto her knees. She flipped through the pages, which were filled with Frank's unmistakable, sprawling handwriting. Instead of the legal jargon of union business, her eyes met a relentless tally of ruin. Losses, dates of midnight gambling runs, and the purple ink of pawnshop seals. In every ledger, Frank had meticulously documented his own descent into a private hell. Maggie gripped the paper so hard it crinkled, feeling the reality of her life begin to slough away like dry plaster from the walls of this grand, deceptive ruin. Maggie spread the books across the grimy floor, her eyes darting between the columns of figures and the dates of the Great Strike. Her finger shook, coming to a dead stop on an entry made the very day the Miners' Relief Fund had been officially declared insolvent. The fortunes the town believed had been swallowed by court fees and government corruption were listed in Frank's books as bets on zero and high-interest credit lines from the casino floor. She saw her father's signature beneath every transaction, a stroke of the pen that had turned the survival of 1,000 families into the dust of a gambling hall. Frank hadn't been fighting for them. He had been wagering their lives and losing. Maggie squeezed her eyes shut, but the numbers remained burned into her mind, a cold arithmetic that erased the sanctity of the man the town called a hero. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging the basement into an absolute, suffocating blackness. Maggie remained huddled on the cold concrete, surrounded by the toxic debris of Frank's secrets. The silence of the cellar felt heavy, pressing against her ears like deep water. As she realized she was now the sole guardian of a truth that would set the entire valley on fire. Maggie shoved the heavy leather ledgers into the gap between the rusted spring frame and the sagging foam of her mattress. The fine dust from the old pages tickled her throat, forcing a muffled, choking cough. From the dining hall below, a violent thud shook the floorboards. Someone was hammering on the oak door with enough force to make the window panes in her bedroom rattle in their frames. She smoothed the quilt with frantic hands, trying to hide the telltale lumps of the hidden evidence. Her palms were slick with a cold, greasy sweat. Every shudder of the house felt like a blow to her skull. Maggie snatched a heavy brass candlestick from her nightstand, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the metal, and headed for the stairs. She moved in a crouch, listening to the muffled, jagged shouts of a man screaming her name from the street. In the doorway, framed by the sickly gray light of a drizzling morning, stood Sean Callahan. His leather jacket shimmered with moisture, and a battered suitcase plastered with garish hotel stickers sat at his feet. Sean stretched his lips into a wide, porcelain-white smile that looked entirely out of place against his hollowed cheeks and the grime of the diner. He made a grand, sweeping gesture with one hand, as if he still owned the air in the room. His voice, thick with a forced, raspy confidence, booming through the empty hall. Maggie watched as he flicked droplets of water from his sleeve directly onto her freshly polished counter. He began to talk over her, claiming his right to a fair share of the inheritance, and calling his return a mission to save the family's honor. All while his darting eyes performed a rapid, predatory appraisal of the antique clock on the wall. Sean stepped behind the counter without an invitation, his hand instinctively finding the hidden shelf where the good bourbon was kept. The amber liquid hit the glass in a heavy stream, filling the air with a sharp, medicinal burn. He took a massive swallow, winced, and slammed the glass down on the laminate with a jarring crack. He leaned in, his eyes locking onto Maggie's with a chilling, knowing glint as he began to rattle off the names of underground casinos in Atlantic City. He spoke of Frank's private memberships and described, with a sick sort of relish, how he had spent years watching from the shadows of the craps tables while their father bled the family's future onto the green felt. Maggie saw in Sean's pupils the icy triumph of a man who had carried a poison for a long time and was finally enjoying the sight of it, working its way through someone else's veins. Sean fished a tri-folded sheet of paper from the inner pocket of his jacket, the document bearing the embossed watermark of Global Mining Corp. He smoothed it out on a sticky tabletop, pinning the corners down with heavy glass salt shakers. To Maggie, the blue ink of the purchase agreement looked like a fresh blood stain on the wood. Sean tapped a blunt finger against the empty signature line, laying out the mechanics of the betrayal. Selling the building to the corporation would provide the perfect front to clean the remaining assets Frank had funneled into offshore accounts before he died. He whispered of millions that would be laundered through the transaction, his voice a low, conspiratorial hiss. Maggie stared at the corporate seal, realizing her brother wasn't offering a way out. He was inviting her to help him rob the people of Black Ridge one last time. Maggie's hand closed around a cheap plastic pen that Sean nudged toward her with a greasy, helpful grin. Instead of touching the nib to the paper, she swung her arm in a sudden, violent arc, snapping the pen across her brother's cheek. It left a thin, red welt along his cheekbone before skittering across the floor. She screamed that she wouldn't let him turn the bones of Black Ridge into blood money, her voice cracking into a raw, jagged sound. Sean slowly reached up to wipe a tiny bead of blood from his face, his expression curdling into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. Maggie felt a surge of pure hatred for this new layer of deception, a lie designed to entomb what was left of her conscience beneath the foundation of a corporate headquarters. The glass of the front door exploded inward in 1,000 diamond-sharp shards as two men in heavy leather jackets kicked their way into the diner. The room suddenly filled with the roar of the wind and the biting cold of the mountain air. One of the men slammed a meaty fist onto a nearby oak table, the wood groaning and splintering under the impact. The second man snatched a chair and swung it with casual, practiced brutality into the pie case, reducing the glass dome to a fine, glittering powder. Maggie retreated toward the back wall, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Sean turn a sickly shade of gray and try to wedge himself into the corner of the bar. The collector's snarled demands for the gambling debts Sean had dragged back with him from the coast. The stench of cheap cologne and stale tobacco smoke swirled with the aroma of the morning coffee, creating a nauseating scent of impending violence. One of the thugs caught Maggie by the upper arm, his grip like a vice, and shoved her hard against the brick wall. The rough masonry bit into her shoulder blades through the thin fabric of her blouse. He leaned in so close she could feel the humid, sour heat of his breath against her skin. The man produced a silver Zippo, and the sharp, mechanical clack of the lid opening sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. A small flame danced in his eyes as he promised to turn Frank's into a funeral pyre for the whole Callahan line if Sean didn't produce the cash by sunset. Maggie looked past him to see Sean huddled on the floor beneath their father's portrait, his arms wrapped around his head, while the other man began to systematically flip the tables, turning her sanctuary into a wreckage of splintered wood and broken dreams. The diner door creaked open once more, and a sliver of the town's judging eyes peered through the shattered frame. Maggie pushed the heavy door open and stopped dead on the threshold. The morning air was thick with the cloying, fermented stench of rot. At her feet lay a woven basket, tipped over and leaking a dark, viscous slime from a heap of overripe tomatoes and blackened cabbage. She watched a swarm of fat, iridescent flies spiral over the mess, settling on a scrap of white paper pinned to the wicker with a rusted, crooked nail. The letters were large and jagged, scrawled in heavy charcoal. No room for traitors in Black Ridge. Maggie felt her stomach lurch at the smell, and she watched as the stagnant juice from the vegetables began to soak into the porous soles of her house shoes, staining them a permanent, sickly brown. The bell above the door rattled frantically against the frame as Toby burst into the hall. The boy's face was a map of angry red blotches, and a thin, bright line of blood leaked from his split lip, spotting the collar of his torn shirt. He was gasping for air, his shoulders vibrating under Maggie's touch as she reached for him. Between jagged, wet sobs, Toby spat out the words that had chased him home. The miner's children had hunted him down the block, cornering him near the porch to scream that Frank Callahan was a rat and a thief. Maggie saw the gray grit of the playground embedded in Toby's scraped knees and a sharp shard of gravel caught in the fabric of his sleeve. Every one of her son's heaving breaths sounded like the crack of a stone, breaking the fragile, hollow shell of the legend she had tried so hard to preserve. Sean Callahan intercepted Maggie on the narrow stairs, pinning her back against the cold iron railing. His fingers, smelling of stale cigarettes and desperation, dug into the soft flesh of her wrist, forcing her palm down onto the thick, textured paper of the contract. He tapped his watch face with a frantic, rhythmic motion, the second hand ticking away the final minutes of his patience. His pupils were blown wide, and a fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He hissed into her ear that in 3 hours, the collectors would stop breaking the furniture and start breaking their bones. Maggie felt the feverish heat radiating from her brother and watched the tremor in his free hand as it hovered over the pen, a desperate predatory energy vibrating between them in the cramped stairwell. Maggie stepped out onto the back lot, where the rhythmic clang of metal against concrete drowned out the low whistle of the mountain wind. Men in stained blue coveralls were dragging heavy, black speaker cabinets across the dirt, setting them up directly on the patches of dead grass. She watched as they bolted together the sections of a high wooden dais, the structure rising like a gallows to block her view of the old mine works. The raw, unweathered timber smelled of pine and sap, a jarring contrast to the city's pervasive scent of coal dust and exhaust. Union flags snapped in the wind, with a sound like heavy wings. She saw the workers tensioning a massive red banner bearing Frank Callahan's name, the bright crimson letters looking to Maggie like a hot iron brand being readied for the side of her own home. Sean slammed his suitcase onto the counter with a heavy thud, crushing a stack of paper napkins beneath the weight. The dry, mechanical clack of the cash register opening echoed through the room. Maggie watched as he raked the last of the crumpled bills into his palm, not even leaving the nickels in their metal slots. He zipped his jacket with a sharp, final sound and tossed Maggie's own wallet, turned inside out and empty, onto the bare tabletop. In the silence of the room, the limp piece of leather looked like the carcass of a small, scavenged animal. Sean refused to meet her gaze, his movements jerky and frantic as he backed toward the door. Maggie realized then that she was truly alone with the debts and the wreckage. While her brother retreated toward the exit, clutching the stolen remnants of their survival to his chest. Maggie picked her way through the dense wall of people gathered at the base of the memorial. The smell of damp wool and cheap lye soap pressed in on her from all sides. Ahead, she caught sight of old Miller's stooped, narrow frame. His fingers, gnarled by arthritis and stained permanently black by the mines, shook as he tried to lay a bunch of wilted daisies on the granite plinth. She watched as the old man's lips moved in a silent, fervent prayer before the bronze image of her father. A single tear traced a clean path through the soot on his cheek. Maggie had to look away, unable to stomach the sight of such pure, unearned devotion from a man whose very pension Frank had converted into poker chips in a smoke-filled room in Jersey. The mayor of Black Ridge struggled up the steps of the platform, tugging at a tie that seemed to be strangling him. As he leaned into the microphone, a piercing shriek of feedback tore across the square, making the crowd wince. He threw his arms wide, his voice amplified into a booming, godlike roar, vibrating in Maggie's very marrow. He hammered out sentences about unshakable honor and the saintly rectitude of Frank Callahan, painting him as a lone anchor in a storm of corporate greed. The square erupted in a wave of applause. Women in faded headscarves dabbed at their eyes, and men nodded with a grim, solemn pride. Maggie looked at those faces, glowing with a desperate, hungry hope, and felt a surge of bitter bile rise in her throat at every hollow adjective the mayor spat into the air. Maggie scanned the fringes of the crowd and felt her heart stutter. Near the brick wall of the old warehouse stood the two men in leather jackets, their stillness making them look like predators in a field of sheep. One of them slowly produced a cigarette and exhaled a long, leisurely stream of smoke, his eyes fixed intently on the stage. She spotted Sean, partially hidden in the shadow of a delivery van, giving the men a barely perceptible nod. The collectors responded with a short, predatory adjustment of their collars. They were waiting for the end of the ceremony, like vultures waiting for a heartbeat to stop. Maggie understood then that the price of their silence was the signature that would finally entomb the town beneath the weight of Frank's lies. Maggie ran into her bedroom and dropped to her knees beside the bed. She shoved her arms under the mattress, her fingers searching frantically between the cold metal springs for the rough texture of the leather covers. When she hauled the heavy ledgers out into the light, a cloud of dust ignited in a stray beam of sun. She crushed the thick volumes against her chest, feeling the cold, dead weight of the numbers seep through her dress to her skin. Her heart hammered against the hard bindings like a trapped bird. In these pages lay the only honest thing Frank Callahan had ever left behind, and it smelled of a damp casino basement instead of honest sweat. She gripped the book so tightly, her nails left permanent crescents in the aged leather. The bedroom door flew open with a violent kick, and Sean charged inside, his chest heaving with exertion. He lunged at Maggie, hands outstretched to snatch the ledgers away, his face twisted into a mask of pure desperation. Maggie spun away, bracing her shoulder against the heavy wardrobe and shoving her brother back with a sudden, explosive force. Sean stumbled, his heels catching on the rug as he hit the wall, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the floor. Maggie screamed that Black Ridge wouldn't get another ounce of this toxic fairy tale, her voice ringing with a clarity that drowned out Sean's frantic excuses. She saw the raw terror in his eyes and realized that she was now the only thing standing between the truth and the final, total collapse of the Callahan name. Maggie stood behind the heavy velvet curtain at the side of the stage. Through a narrow slit, she saw a sea of weathered faces, hundreds of people whose skin had been etched by decades of hard labor and the long, slow rot of waiting for a miracle. The air in the wings was dead and smelled of old, dry timber. She watched the calloused hands of the miners, some folded in prayer, others clutching sweat-stained caps. Every one of their futures had been gambled away in a smoke-filled room in Atlantic City. Maggie felt the weight of the evidence in her arms overbalance the fear for her own life. Her gaze lingered on the empty, skeletal frames of the mine hoists in the distance. Structures Frank had sold out long before he ever drew his last breath. Maggie made a sharp, decisive movement, stepping out from the shadows and into the blinding glare of the stage lights. The dull hum of the crowd vanished instantly, replaced by a thick, expectant tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. She walked to the microphone, which emitted a low, electronic growl. She set the leather-bound ledgers onto the wooden lectern, and the sound of the books hitting the timber echoed across the square like a gunshot. Maggie's fingers brushed the first page, her skin tingling against the paper that held the power to burn the whole town down. Maggie cracked open the first ledger, the dry leather of the spine creaking audibly into the microphone. She stepped closer to the stand, which hummed with a sharp, metallic vibration. Her voice, thrown across the square by the massive speakers, shook the air as she began to read the dates and the cold, unyielding columns of loss. She hammered out the sums, pausing only to inject the names of the victims. The Miller family, 3,000. The Widow's Relief Fund, 5,000. Every word hit the crowd like a heavy, leaden blow. The mountain wind caught the loose scraps of old markers, swirling them over the heads of the assembly. Maggie watched as the miners clenched their fists, their faces shifting from celebratory masks into expressions of stone-cold, burgeoning fury. Sean Callahan burst onto the dais, his boots thudding heavily against the raw timber. He grabbed for the microphone stand, and Maggie could smell the sour, panicked sweat radiating from him. He lunged for the ledger, but Maggie drove her elbow into his chest, shoving him back toward the edge of the platform. With her free hand, she pointed toward the two men in leather jackets standing by the warehouse wall. The collectors instinctively reached for their pockets, suddenly aware of the hundreds of hateful eyes pivoting toward them. Maggie screamed into the mic, identifying these men as the living shadows of Frank Callahan's debts. Sean froze, his face turning the color of ash under the weight of 1,000 gazes that had finally seen the truth of the family's betrayal. Old Miller pulled himself up from the ground, his knees making a dry, splintering sound that seemed to carry even over the low growl of the crowd. He took a stumbling step toward the stage, his gnarled fingers hooking over the edge of the wooden platform. Maggie leaned down, thrusting the open ledger toward him, where Frank's sprawling signature sat next to the purple stamp of a Jersey pawn shop. The old man squinted, his lips trembling as he recognized the handwriting of his hero on a document of ruin. A low rhythmic rumble began to move through the square, sounding like the start of a deep-seated mountain slide. Maggie watched the daisies fall from Miller's weak grip, scattering into the mud. The idol had shattered, leaving behind nothing but the smell of dust and the bitter realization of a lifetime spent believing a lie. The mayor of Black Ridge waved his hands frantically, signaling to a pair of guards in crisp, dark uniforms. They began to shove through the crowd, their shoulders knocking roughly against the miners. Maggie saw a tall worker in oil-stained coveralls step into their path, his massive chest forming a barrier they couldn't easily bypass. Other men closed ranks, a wall of broad backs and stubborn elbows forming a human shield in front of the stage. The mayor opened his mouth to shout, but his voice was swallowed by the demanding roar of the people, who were now screaming to hear every single word from the black books. Maggie felt the entire stage vibrate with the rhythmic stomping of heavy boots. The guards retreated before the wall of silent, angry men, and Maggie turned the page back to the light, continuing her relentless public audit. Maggie hoisted the heavy ledgers high above her head and hurled them with all her strength into the center of the crowd. The leather bindings struck upraised hands, and the pages, caught by a sudden gust of wind, tore free and scattered like white birds over the square. She turned to the representative from Global Mining, who was still clutching a gold-plated pen. She snatched the purchase agreement from the table and, looking him directly in the eye, slowly ripped the thick paper in half, then into quarters. The scraps of the contract fluttered down to the muddy boards, mixing with the filth. Maggie announced to the microphone that the soul of Black Ridge wasn't for sale to cover a dead man's sins. The silence that followed her words felt louder to Maggie than any explosion she had ever heard in the mines. Sean Callahan backed toward the rear stairs of the dais, his eyes darting like trapped animals over the faces of the neighbors he had tried to swindle. As he hit the ground, the collectors in the leather jackets separated from the warehouse wall and began to move toward him with a slow, purposeful stride. Sean broke into a desperate run, his shoes slipping on the wet grass. Maggie watched from the height of the stage as her brother vanished into the narrow alleyway between the warehouses, with the debt collectors following behind like hounds after a scent. The miners stepped aside to let the chase pass, following Sean with a chorus of low whistles and jagged curses. Maggie realized then that the ghosts of Atlantic City had finally cornered him. Right here in the ruins of the legend he had tried to sell. The building inspector entered the empty diner, the echo of his footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the hollowed-out space. Maggie stood by the window, watching him pick up a folder from the counter that bore a heavy government seal. The official didn't look at her. He simply reached into his bag and pulled out a roll of neon-orange adhesive tape. A sharp, rhythmic snapping sound filled the room as he applied the strips in a jagged X across the massive oak door and the dust-filmed glass of the front windows. Through the glass, Maggie read the bold, black letters. Danger. Structure condemned. The lingering scent of old fryer grease was finally being choked out by the chemical smell of industrial adhesive. She ran her finger over the notch in the counter one last time, accepting the tape as a final, necessary divorce from the past. Maggie carried the last cardboard box out to the porch, the sides secured with thick, amber tape. She saw old Miller sitting on a nearby bench, looking smaller and more hunched than he had only a few days ago. She walked over and pressed a thick, heavy envelope into his coal-stained palm. Inside was the cash from the sale of the coffee machine and the copper piping she had stripped from the basement. Miller tried to push it back, but Maggie closed his fingers over the paper with a firm, uncompromising grip. He looked up at her with eyes that were no longer clouded by the worship of Frank Callahan, but held a new, heavy kind of respect for the woman standing before him. Maggie gave him a short nod, feeling a small part of the fire in her chest cool at the sight of that one small act of restitution. Maggie walked to the wall behind the counter where the heavy portrait had hung for nearly 30 years. She gripped the gilded frame, and a thick curtain of gray dust cascaded onto her apron. As the painting pulled away from the wall, a bright, clean rectangle of wallpaper remained, the only mark left of the man Frank Callahan had pretended to be. She didn't look at the painted face. She simply leaned the canvas against a pile of broken chairs in the center of the room. In the hollowed-out space, stripped of its furniture and its purpose, the portrait looked small, gaudy, and entirely irrelevant. Maggie turned her back on it and walked toward the door, never once looking back at the kindly crinkle of the painted eyes that she now knew were just clever strokes of oil meant to hide a void. Toby stood by the tailgate of the old pickup truck, his face set in a look of grim, adult-like concentration. He took a box of kitchen supplies from Maggie's hands and slid it deep into the bed of the truck, wedging it under a heavy tarp. On top, he carefully placed several paper packets of sunflower and tomato seeds that Maggie had kept for a spring that never came to Black Ridge. She watched as her son adjusted the edge of a wool blanket, tucking it around their meager belongings to shield them from the road grit. A metal bed frame clattered in the back as Toby climbed onto the running board to check the knots on the rope. Maggie touched his shoulder, feeling the solid heat of him through his jacket, and realized that for the first time in her life, the sunrise belonged to them and no one else. Maggie turned the key in the ignition, and the truck responded with a long, hacking roar before settling into a steady, vibrating idle. She shifted the gear into drive, and the vehicle lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of rust-colored dust from the gravel drive. She caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. The skeletal mine hoists, looking like the picked-over ribs of a dead giant, began to shrink and fade into the gray mountain mist. There was no longer a need to defend walls built on a foundation of lies, or to keep a fire burning in a hearth that had never been honest. Maggie felt the invisible bands that had constricted her lungs for years finally snap. She drew a breath so deep it made her ribs ache, tasting a freedom that was cold and sharp, like water drawn from a deep mountain well. The pickup rattled across the rusted steel spans of the bridge that marked the official edge of Black Ridge. Maggie gripped the steering wheel with a steady, relaxed hand, feeling the hum of the road beneath her. Beside her, Toby leaned his head against the window, watching the dark green blur of the Appalachian trees as they began the long descent toward the valley. The town, the diner, and the heavy, gilded frame of the Callahan name were now nothing more than a receding point on the horizon. Ahead of them, the road stretched out in a long, clean ribbon of gray, leading toward a future that had no blueprint, no legends, and no more secrets to keep. Maggie pressed her foot to the gas, and the truck carried them away from the shadows and into the wide, unwritten light of the open country.